A 6-year-old Palestinian-American boy is stabbed to death in a Chicago suburb. The head of the Council on American-Islamic Relations in Chicago says biased media coverage of the ongoing Hamas-Israel conflict is to blame. Does he have a point? I'm Andy Zopp. This is Chicago Newsroom 2.0, and we'll get to it all on the other side of the break.
I'm Walter, host of the podcast 3 Questions With. Mentors play an essential role by stepping up in their communities to support teens in helping them achieve personal, academic, and professional goals. Meeting the Moment is Big Brothers Big Sisters of Metropolitan Chicago.
A mentor is not only just for them to guide them and give them that extra support, but to also help them in finding resources.
Join us on Wednesdays at 7:30 in the evening via Channel 19, streaming on cantv.org and the Can TV Plus app.
If today's show had a theme, it would probably have to be re-examination. We'll do a panel discussion in a few minutes where we'll re-examine media bias in reporting. But first, we're going to have a one-on-one conversation with a woman who wants us to re-examine how we view employment and job placement opportunities. She runs an organization that believes that our current approach to employment is riddled with problems and says her group is on a mission to help us rethink work. Please help me welcome to the program Dr. Lisa Bly-Jones, CEO of the Chicago Jobs Council. Welcome, Lisa.
Hi, thanks so much for having me.
Thank you for being here. So let's start laying the groundwork for my audience. What is the Chicago Jobs Council?
The Chicago Jobs Council is a member-based workforce development intermediary organization. And we do our work in 3 ways. We keep the Job Center at the center of everything we do. And so our advocacy is around the things that will better serve job seekers, particularly those job seekers that face barriers to employment. Additionally, the advocacy work is around quality jobs, and I say quality jobs and not just any job, because it's really important these days that we're thinking about quality in employment. And then also we do policy work. We influence local, state, and federal policy around workforce development. And finally, we build capacity for the field, and we do that in our learning cohorts, our trainings, and then we have some leadership development that we do as well for the field of workforce development professionals.
Wow, that's a lot of work you do over there. Well, there were a couple of things you said I want to circle back with, but I want to start with something that I know is on your website. You say that our current workforce system is flawed. Tell me what that means and what you think, what needs to change.
Yeah, so whenever you think about systems, you think about all of these organizations that are supposed to be working together as interconnected. So you think about the education and the training providers that are supposed to prepare you for employment. And then you think about the hiring process that is supposed to ensure that you actually move into employment and potentially that you can advance. And then all of these systems are supposed to be working together, and in some instances they're actually flawed. And they're flawed in that, first, the level of investments to actually help prepare for a skilled workforce. So what does that look like in terms of preparing individuals? Do we have adequate investments to actually properly prepare someone for employment that may have barriers? And when I think about barriers, it could be someone who doesn't have a high school diploma and wants to move into a training program, and there's this expectation that you must have a high school diploma or a GED, or you may not even be able to enroll in a job training program that would put you on a path for a quality job and change the trajectory of your life. So that is one way that I think about the system in terms of the interlocking of the job training program, and then the potential for employment, and then the possibility of advancement.
Right. In my previous life, I worked in workforce in a variety of settings. I worked at the Urban League, at World Business Chicago. You know, we worked a lot with employers who were coming here looking for workforce, and at one point we were doing a strategic plan for the city, and what we found is, first of all, the workforce agencies don't always talk to each other. And second of all, there's this huge gap between what schools are teaching, even city colleges, right? Which has programs that are aimed at helping people get ready for work, aren't connected to what the employers need.
Exactly.
And so I think that's in part one of the things you're talking about. And I think finding ways to cross those bridges is really important.
Absolutely. And one of the things, as you point out, about getting job training programs, whether that is with city colleges or other job training providers, sometimes we're training for the jobs of today, and we're not looking ahead at the jobs that are coming. So the jobs that are of the future, as these jobs today are starting to fall away, and how do you prepare folks for the jobs that are coming? And what I think about a lot is clean energy, for one. That's a big area that we're seeing now. And so how are we preparing this current workforce for those possibilities? The infrastructure investments, all of those investments that say these are potential jobs with great salaries, great benefits. How do we prepare people for those? And I think we also touched on the fact that it's not always just about putting someone into a training program. It is all of the wraparound services that people need, whether that is transportation, whether that is child care. I'm reminded of all of the added measures that were put in place during the pandemic. We had the guaranteed income pilots, where you had the guaranteed income where people could actually use the funds where they needed it for a set period of time. But it was critical in terms of meeting the needs that don't necessarily fall into your standardized job training supportive service program model.
We also had child care supports, right? There was benefits for child care. There were supports to child care providers because they were challenged in the beginning of the pandemic when children couldn't come there. You and I talked about earlier that when I started the Urban League, I was like, great, we're doing job training, here's a job. And you think, okay, I got you a job, we're good. And then you realize that when someone hasn't, depending on their environment, or how they grew up, where they grew up, their background, they might not have the skill sets or the experience to take on, to understand kind of the ground rules that around work and showing up, and then stuff happens, right? Your daycare provider doesn't show up, your car breaks down. And so to your point, I think it's really important that we think about the wraparound services for people who are in the workforce. And I think that's part of what you do, right? Is advocate for that.
We do. We advocate. Chicago Jobs Council was instrumental in pushing for a barrier reduction fund, which is all about getting additional funds so that you can remove the barriers that individuals face when they're trying to move into employment, like we talked about with the transportation, or whether that's the child care, or even taking some of the tests after you complete the actual job training program. And something else you mentioned when you talked about the fact that each individual has a unique set of circumstances. And so one of the things I often think about is a more holistic approach to helping job seekers, because it's not cookie cutter. Every individual has a unique set of circumstances that need to be addressed. And that is part of the process, even when we think about this system and changing this system in terms of the way we actually engage with job seekers. How are you coaching a job seeker to even think about executive functioning? How do I put my life in order? Something else that you made me think about when you mentioned the employers, the whole cultural competency. It's one thing to prepare individuals for the workplace and try to tell them all the things to prepare them, but sometimes when they actually get to the workplace, those environments are not very welcoming. And so that's a whole nother level of now you need to engage and talk with the employers about, we have this huge untapped talent pool that you're missing out on because some of the environments are not prepared to handle a new individuals coming into their workplaces.
And I think totally right. And I also think employers need to understand, and the good ones do, it's not forever, right? It's transitional, right? It's just that some individuals need more support than just the initial, here's your initial training. That training has to be broader. And as they grow, they will be better employees. If they're successful, they will be committed. And so I think many employers that I've worked with understand that, but sometimes you have to get them there. But you also mentioned, I want to go back to a topic, something you mentioned in your opening when you were talking about the Jobs Council, because you mentioned quality jobs, that you fight for quality jobs. And I think it's really important for people to understand, that we want people to be able to move into jobs that will have a living wage. Right? What I often think about when people are fighting so hard for $15 minimum wage, and it's important, really important, so much better than 10 or 11. But the truth is, if you're going to have a family, you're supporting a family, you're going to need more than the minimum wage eventually. And so you want to be able to move people into those higher paying jobs, and that requires training, right?
It requires training. It also requires an investment, and it's no different than the expectation most professionals have when they move into employment. There is this idea that your employer would hire you and make an investment in you to retain you. And so it's that same mindset that even if it's an entry-level job, that the same level of investment would be made in an individual and make it a quality job, which means the wages are wages that you can actually take care of your family on. It's like the dignity in the work. It is not just the wages, it is a set schedule. A normal schedule so that you can have a life. You can build your life around knowing that I have a set schedule. I know what hours I'm going to be working, what days off I'm going to have, so I can do what I need to do for my family. If I need to be here for my children, I can do that because I have a set schedule. And I think what we're seeing right now, we're seeing quite a few strikes. We're seeing all of this effort towards workers' rights now. And so we're seeing the tide changing in that. And so it's fascinating to watch and see the flexibility now with the labor market being what it is. And so looking for individuals to fill those vacancies that exist, there's some flexibility, but we also want to make sure that it's sustainable. Yeah.
Believe it or not, we are out of time. You have been great. It was a really fascinating conversation, and obviously we could go on for longer. So
we could.
Thank you for being here. We will be right back after this.
Joining me on the next episode of Every Day is a Yay is Saloni.
If you don't believe in yourself, you're robbing the world of what you can achieve. That really spoke to me and made me feel like if I don't believe in my own power, then I'm actually doing everyone else a disservice.
Join the conversation Thursdays at 7:30 p.m. on CanTV, cable channel 19, and streaming on cantv.org and the CanTV Plus app. Experience the power of community television.
The unthinkable happened recently when a 71-year-old landlord stabbed two of his tenants, killing a 6-year-old boy and critically wounding his mother. That landlord has been charged with a hate crime in the death of the 6-year-old, as he and his mother are both Palestinian American. And now the head of the Chicago office of the Council on American Islamic Relations, or CARE Chicago, is calling out the media, saying that anti-Muslim coverage of the Israeli-Hamas conflict fueled the hate that led to the young boy's slaying. Does he have a point, or is he off base? Is the coverage of the conflict slanted so far towards one side of the issue that the other becomes collateral damage, or is there something else at play? Here to help us in this discussion is Leigh Giangreco, a reporter for Crain Chicago Business, and Darrious Hilmon, CanTV's executive director and the host of In the Arena. Thank you both for joining me for this challenging topic. So, there are issues on both sides. Was the CARE executive director right? Did the media coverage, Leigh, you have been covering the story. Did or your paper has been? Did the story the coverage been slanting hate towards Palestinian Americans?
I think it's fair to say that not just in this particular war in Gaza that's going on right now, that just historically American journalists haven't done a good job of portraying the full humanity of the Palestinian people. I think about someone who actually did a really good job of that was Anthony Bourdain when he went to Gaza.
Right.
And he, ate with Palestinian people and, showed their food and, basically showed their joy. And he said the world has visited many terrible things on the Palestinian people, none more shameful than robbing them of their basic humanity. And I think the lesson from that is, we need to do more human interest stories. I see a lot of analogies here, or I think it's analogous to how the U.S. media has, approached like BLM or has covered the Black community, is that we will often show up to an area just when tragedy strikes, but we're not there to just cover, basic everyday life. And I think that's the way that you humanize a community. And I also think, more importantly for journalists, that's the way that you build trust, so that when tragedy does happen, you can understand all the people there and, get all of the sides that you need.
So important. There's a lot to unpack in what you just said, but I want to start with the fact that we often, when we talk about Palestinians, often it's in the context of Hamas, or which is a group as a terrorist or as a militant organization. Let me put it that way. And in this particular instance, this particular set of coverage started with some horrific events in Israel. What do you think the impact? How did that, begin to move the coverage in a particular direction?
I think I'll go back to the original sort of thesis. I think there is so much more media and so much lower quality of journalistic integrity. I think telling a story or showing a piece of the story versus showing multiple sides of the story. I'm old enough where I remember the Fourth Estate. It was to really dig in. And we've become, even with more coverage 24/7, it feels soundbite. Here is what I think I've watched the coverage and hoped for. What Hamas did in Israel and to the people of Israel, unacceptable, and there will be repercussions, full stop. And I watched a story with a Jewish woman with Anderson Cooper, and my heart broke. You could feel the pain, the loss of life, the not knowing where her family was, trying to send them love through the screen. A day later, I watched in similar tears as a young Palestinian girl were watching in real time be literally snatched from her mom, screaming, "Take me with her. If you're gonna hurt, hurt me too." Right. So it is difficult, but I think full stop, unacceptable what happened. But I'm from Detroit, where it is the largest Middle Eastern community outside of the Middle East, and a large contingent of Jewish folks. So there are folks on all sides of this really big, complicated issue who I consider friends and friends like family, and there is pain. And I believe that these things, peacefully coexist is the wrong word. Multiple things can be true. Right now, in the heat of this moment, in this crisis, I think placing the focus as they are working through this and it's still active, I can understand the journalists focusing on what happened with Hamas and Israel. I want, though, my hope would be, because this is a human issue, that will impact relationships even here in Chicago in this multicultural environment. I understand emotion. Pain is pain, and my heart breaks as I watch these stories. What my fear is, if the media does not take more care, you will add fuel to an unbelievably, inexplicably painful situation that will have repercussions that a ratings point or a soundbite isn't worth.
Right. Well, I think, there's a couple points, again, in there. You guys are really raising a lot of issues, but there's a couple points. Let's think about how media covers anything, right? We are, you noted, there's a shooting, we go, we talk, we show the neighborhood, we show the black man standing on the corner, and we talk about that. But the point is, the first thing that happened here was a horrific event. So all you saw for 24 hours was this coverage of this horrific event done by undertaken by Palestinian Americans, or not Palestinian Americans, excuse me, by Hamas. But that's how we talk about it. Then a couple days later, there was a hospital that was blown up, and then all we talked about was the hospital. Does that whole, we own, our immediate focus on the crisis, not the things that may have led to the crisis, does that make it worse? Is that part of the problem?
Yeah, and I think it's an issue, especially with this conflict. I think if you try and start the conversation by asking who started it, that's not going to be a very productive conversation. You could trace this, 50 or 60 years back, or you could even look, I remember some of the protests in Chicago in the spring of 2021 when Palestinians in a neighborhood in East Jerusalem were facing evictions, and there was violence that stemmed from that. And of course, Palestinians have been arguing basically that these conflicts aren't coming out of nowhere. They're, they've been oppressed for many years, but then of course that doesn't justify any of these attacks at the hand of Hamas. So yeah, it's a complicated issue to unravel, but I don't know that approaching it on this sort of ad hoc basis is the best way.
Right. I think it's very hard. And then the other point, is the point, Darrious, that you touched on. It's very emotional. This is a very emotional topic. It's hard to see people suffering. And it's also, and so we want to blame somebody, right? And so the need to blame, and you and I touched on this when we were talking about this, setting up this segment. It inflames people, and how does the media manage? How can you, as a reporter or as someone who covers media, how do you help tell the story but tamp down the emotions?
And I think it is simple things. My degree is in journalism, and I work here in community access television. The humanistic side. Imagine as we're covering these stories, as we have these conversations, it is painful to watch, but if I were a Jewish mom or brother or sister and that was my family, similarly, right, wrong, or otherwise, when I saw that little girl, she might as well have been my sister. So I think journalism, and again, this is one painful, breathtakingly painful example where journalism has, I believe, lost its way. Part of what our job is in these spaces with the privilege of being on air or have newspaper copy is to start with the human and to, as fairly, as completely as possible, and know that it cannot be told in 20 minutes. But to also be the conveners are going, listen, we understand the pain. Can we find spaces to have conversation? Can we find spaces to bring community back together? Because my fear is this is not the first and unfortunately not the last. So then the question becomes, in the dash moments, what do we do? What conversations do we have? Because I can imagine where you might be on the issue, but to see humans in pain and suffering, I just have to believe we are all collectively capable of so much more.
Right. Well, I agree with that. Leigh, but how about you? How do you manage, covering very emotional topics in ways that don't elevate the hate part of it, but report the news that you're obligated to report?
Well, it's been difficult. I guess I try and give it context. Last week when this happened, I reported on how Illinois and Chicago politicians were reacting to it. So on top of just saying, here are their statements, I try to also say that, they came out earlier in the week and said, we must stand by Israel. So I think you can't ever just show something in a vacuum. And so I think that's a big part of it, again, is just giving that context.
Yeah, I think one thing also that I've seen and I liked is also telling the other side of the story. So I did see one news report that was talking about after at the festival where they had the shooting, and about how there were because this is another thing people don't know, there are Israeli Palestinians, right? There are Palestinians who live and are Israelis, and they were driving through the festival trying to pick people up and save them. Yeah. It's a powerful story, right? About the fact that it's not all hate. They're not all, and many of the people, Israelis, while they're devastated, are not supporting, going in and killing other Palestinians. So I think telling those stories as well, so that people can understand that this is not by far a black and white, is really important. I don't know.
And there have been several progressive Jewish American groups that were protesting outside the White House last week as well, basically decrying Israel's bombing against those in Gaza. And so I think that's another example of what you've just shown, is that it's not all black and white. It's not that, everyone who's Jewish in America is quote unquote standing by Israel. They don't immediately condone everything that the military and the government is doing right now in Gaza. And I think showing that gives that important nuance to this issue.
And I think and that we have run out of time, but I think also recognizing that standing with the Israeli people, standing with the Palestinian people, do not have to be two separate things, mutually exclusive, right? Yeah. Thank you both so much for being with me for this challenging but really important conversation. I truly appreciate it. We'll be right back with my final thoughts.
Hi, I'm Darrious Hilmon. Joining me on the next In the Arena, the chair of the City Club of Chicago, Jackie Robinson Ivey.
To whom much is given, much is required. And, I could not be the half-time good Christian that I try to be if I was not giving back.
Join the conversation Tuesday at 7 p.m. on CAN TV Cable Channel 19 and streaming on cantv.org and the CAN TV Plus app. Experience the power of community television.
In addition to being a television host, a businesswoman, and a former prosecutor, I'm also a mom. And as a parent, I cannot imagine the anguish of the family of that young 6-year-old, how they must feel, knowing he met such a horrible end. With that being said, what's even more unimaginable is the idea of speaking vitriol or rhetoric that would encourage inflicting violence on children because of religious differences. These past few years have been very challenging for many of us, and facing a barrage of challenges can push even the most even-keeled among us to express our frustrations. But however angry, upset, or frustrated we are, encouraging hatred or violence toward any group and forgetting the basic humanity of a people is wrong and has to be resisted, or we will continue to move down a path that is dangerous for us all. Thanks for tuning in. Until next time, be well and well informed.